Okay, hello everyone. A warm welcome from a very, very cold Bloemfontein. We are very excited to have you here. We are very excited to have Elize Janse van Rensburg here. I just want to quickly do a quick introduction about ourselves for some of you that don't know us. My name is Karen Visser. I'm married to Dion, and we are a family-owned business. My sister Marlies is also part of our business, and together, three of us are the owners of BioLink Attention Training, and we are an international company. And our business actually started because of my own son that was diagnosed with ADHD. He had sensory integration challenges, he had learning barriers, and he's on the autistic spectrum. So I know how it feels to be worried about your child. And that's actually how our business came about. And what kept us up and standing was wonderful people like Elize, therapists that plays an important role in one's life when you are faced with challenges. And so we are very, very fortunate tonight to have Elize here. She's really one of the most kind-hearted persons that I know. She is a lecturer at the university, but she also has her own practice, and she has got loads of experience. And what I personally like about Elize is that she's got an approach of looking holistically at children and at parents, and then custom fitting a program for a child. She's not a boxy person, if I can call it that. And that's what I so love about her. And she talks in a manner that anyone can understand. So Elize, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I know you've got small children as well, so this is a difficult time, so we really appreciate you being with us. And I mean, you're going to be with us next Thursday as well. She said she gets so excited about this topic that she can't talk too little, so we gave her 2 slots so that she can say everything that she wants to say. So you'll see there's a chat box. If you have any questions, just pop in your chats, your questions in there. I will take notes of that. And at the end, when Elize is finished, we will then go through all the questions, and then Elize can answer that for us. So I'm going to leave you, and Elize, thank you again. And we are so excited to learn from you. Okay.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Karen. And it's really a privilege and an honor to be part of your talk series in the evenings, and to be able to share on a topic that's really close to my heart and that I indeed have a lot of love and passion for. And so thank you for giving me 2 slots so that I can speak my heart out. I really appreciate that. And I look forward to sharing this time with you and with everyone that's joining us. So thank you very much, and we can get started on the evening. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about sensory integration, and it's probably a word that you've heard a lot, and it's probably a word that you might have a few pictures of in your head. So I'm going to share a couple of pictures with you on the screen, and maybe as I go through them, you will relate to one of them, you might not, but maybe choose a picture that you think, I've seen this, either in myself, in one of my children, in one of the children that I teach, someone that I do have a relationship with, but see if there's something that you can identify with that might give you an idea of what we will be sharing about tonight. So I'm just going to scroll through a few of the pictures, and we will make meaning of them as we go along. Don't know if you have any pictures like this in your own homes, but I think many of these pictures are things that many of us can relate to if we have kids. So now the question is, what do these questions have to do with our topic, sensory integration? And when we talk about sensory integration, we're obviously going to start with our sensory systems. So at school, we learn about different sensory systems. We learn about being able to hear, see, touch, smell, taste, and then it pretty much stops there. And I'm going to just share 3 more senses with you tonight. Some of you may be very familiar with them. For some, it might be the first time that you hear them. The other three senses that are really important in our functioning as human beings are our sense of movement, and the receptors for our sense of movement is located in our inner ears. Some people refer to it as our balance sense. The fancy word is our vestibular sense, and that sense gives us an idea of where we are in relation to gravity. Then we have our proprioceptive sense, which is a sense that is really spread out throughout our body, and that gives us our sense of body position. That is the sense that will tell you, if you close your eyes and you hold up one hand, that you can put the other hand in the same position without having to look. It tells you where you are and where your body parts are relative to one another. And then the third one is our internal body sense, and the word for that is interoception, but that is the sense that gives us information about what's going on inside of our bodies. Things like being hungry or being thirsty, knowing when to go to the toilet, feelings of anxiety, those physiological feelings that we feel when we are anxious. All of those things are also sensory signals that get sent to our brain through that internal body sense. Now, our brain has to make sense of all the information that comes in through these senses. And when a baby is born, the senses are pretty much all that they come into the world with. So if we think about childhood development as a house, and what role our sensory systems play in the development of this house, or the building of this house, we have a foundation, and that foundation is made up of our senses. When a baby is born, that baby comes into the world without any skills. They have the ability to identify when they are uncomfortable, whether that's hunger, or they're too cold, or they're not close enough to mommy. And they have a few primitive reflexes that enable them to move their body parts. But ultimately, through processing the information that they get into their nervous systems through their senses, they develop all the other skills that build this house. But we know that if a foundation is not strong, we have a few probabilities of cracks forming higher up in the house. So in our house analogy, our walls represent other skills that we learn: motor skills, perceptual skills, being able to ultimately sit up straight in a chair, attend at school, learn how to read and write, working up towards the roof that enables us to participate every day in our environment. And this house is situated within an environment. And so if we find that children struggle to cope with the demands of life, we need to go and look at where are the problems? Why are there cracks in this developmental house? And I will try to show you how many of the cracks are often related to how the information is processed in the senses and how that affects development later on. So here's another picture of this house, just to show you that our foundation is at the bottom in the form of our senses, and that through the way our brain processes that information, which is the gray bar that's represented there, we build that foundation, we use that information, and so we build all of our other skills on that until we are ultimately able to participate in all of those things that are at the top of the roof, which are just some examples of things that children need to and want to do every day. So if we look at the senses at the bottom of the house, we're going to look a little bit more deeply into how the brain processes that information. But before we do the processing part, I thought just to share some interesting tidbits with you about our different senses. So did you know that our sense of touch provides the most basic form of physical and emotional security? If we look at how infants develop, the way in which a caregiver, a parent, or someone who takes care of that baby interacts with that baby, touches that baby, that is what gives them a sense of emotional and physical security. How do we know this? There's a lot of research that has been done in countries that have wars, or where there's lots of children in orphanages, and where they do not get this regular, affectionate, tactile input, and that there are actual brain scan evidence for how the development of the brain is adversely affected by deprivation of this tactile input through our sense of touch. So I just always find that incredibly interesting, and to know that we cannot spoil a baby by picking them up, because that security that they get from that physical interaction with us is so important ultimately for their development. Another interesting thing about our sense of body position, did you know that without your sense of body position, you would have to look at every body part every time that you move it? If your brain didn't get the information automatically from the joints and from the tendons that attach our muscles to the joints, and from the muscle spindle fibers themselves in the muscles, then you would literally have to monitor every single movement that you make with your body. Now, again, how do we know this? There's a really interesting video clip that if you are looking for something to watch, you can look at it on YouTube. The video is called "The Man Who Lost His Body." And this is the story of a man who had a disease or neurological occurrence where he lost his sense of proprioception. And this video shows how he literally has to monitor every step he takes. He cannot walk without watching his feet. So a very interesting thing to know, that really without this sense we would be very, very impaired. And then something else that's interesting is that our vestibular system doesn't function in the absence of gravity. So astronauts get a form of motion sickness when they are in space, as they don't get feedback through their vestibular systems. So if you think about like a water bottle floating in space, there's nothing telling that bottle whether it's upright or not. And this is what happens in our inner ears, because in our vestibular apparatus in our ears, there's fluid. And the way that fluid moves in response to gravity is what tells us where we are in relation to gravity. So without gravity, we don't have a functioning vestibular system, and that can cause adverse reactions. So I just found that also quite an interesting thing to know about that vestibular system. Now, there's a good reason why I highlight these three systems tonight above many of the others in the examples that I'm giving, because these three systems play a really, really big role in function. And because they are hidden, because we cannot see how well someone maybe can experience touch, a sense of movement, or a sense of body position, we forget to look at how those senses influence function at the end of the day. And they have a very big impact on how we function. So if we look then at how this information that is gathered through the senses is then processed in the brain, we know that these sense organs are located all over our bodies, and they then send the information to our brain. In our brain, a few important things happen, and we're going to look at each, or at three of those things, two tonight and then two next week. So that's 4 in total. And through that processing that happens and that the brain is doing in different parts of the brain, ultimately it enables us to have good function. And good function can be anything from being able to pay attention, regulating our emotions, being motivated to do things, coordinating our body movements, learning, problem solving, and the list goes on. So the way the brain processes sensory information has an impact on all of those outputs that our bodies have. And if you are sitting here because you or your child struggle with any of those things on the list, or many others, looking at sensory processing is important, because there is a good chance that somewhere, either in the beginning, the middle, or the end part of how that sensory information is processed by the brain, there might be a glitch in the system. And that is sometimes pure biological variation, just the way our brain is wired. And some of it can be related to other conditions, which I will refer to a little bit later. But it's important to note here just that how our brain processes sensory information has an influence on the things that we are able to do when we participate in the world and when we interact with the world. And so it has an influence on our meaningful interaction with everything and everyone around us. So sensory information at the end of the day then needs to be organized and integrated in the brain. Those are two things that need to happen so that we can use that information, because without using that information, the information is useless. So that use, the way we use the sensory information, can refer to how we perceive our body or the world, how we see it, how we feel it, and what meaning we make from it. It could be a learning process or an adaptive response, which is a word that just means that you adapt to the demands of your environment. Or it can be the development of some new neural function. We know that right throughout our lives, we develop different neural functions and capacities. The brain is plastic, so to speak. The brain plasticity is something that we bargain on from a therapeutic perspective, because we can change the way the brain processes information. And so this neuroplasticity is something that happens in correlation with or together with how the brain processes that sensory information. And then Jean Ayres, for those of you that are familiar with sensory integration theory, was the mother of sensory integration theory. And she would have been, I'm going to check the date, she would have been 100 years old in 2 days' time. So right around the world, everybody is celebrating the legacy of Jean Ayres at the moment. And she said that through sensory integration, the many parts of the nervous system work together so that a person can interact with the environment effectively and experience appropriate satisfaction. And I always like taking a definition or a statement like this in reverse and asking, so does that mean that if sensory integration is not happening, it can cause me to not have positive experiences and appropriate satisfaction with what I'm doing every day? And thus the answer is yes. So it's really fundamental in our existence as human beings to be able to process sensory information effectively and integrate that information into our whole beings so that we can function well. And I know it sounds a little bit philosophical at this point, but I promise it will get practical very soon. So how do the sensory systems then support development? That's the next question. So if it's so important, why is it and how is it? And so the first thing is that the sensory systems allow our brains to make sense of our body. Where is my body? And that is why those senses that I've highlighted in the form of the tactile, proprioceptive, and vestibular systems are so important, because those three systems really give us detailed information about our bodies, and then making sense of the environment, again drawing on that vestibular system, and then our visual system, our sense of hearing, and everything else that happens around us. And through processing it, we can make sense of that. When our brains then have accurate information about the environment and how we relate to it, the brain can then successfully respond to the demands of the environment. And that process of taking the information, processing it, and generating an appropriate response at the end is then what we refer to as sensory integration in a bigger sense. So important childhood functions, things that you will hear teachers and everyone else interested in childhood development refer to, things like fine and gross motor coordination, planning new movements, developing perceptual skills so that I can learn how to read and write. All of those processes rely very heavily on sensory integration and impacts the child's capacity to learn and function in the environment. And this is one of the reasons that I am so grateful for the opportunity to have 2 sessions, because tonight we are going to focus primarily on how sensitive or not a child is to sensory input. But after that, so much happens. And that is what we will talk about when we join each other again next week. So if I then try and untangle sensory integration into different processes that happen in the brain, I'm going to do it a little bit in boxes, and these processes don't happen in boxes. They all happen simultaneously, but for us to understand what they are, it is important just to zoom in on each of them at a specific point in time. So the first thing that happens when we see something, hear something, smell something, something touches our skin, is that our nervous system registers that information. So you have to get enough input through whatever sense we are referring to for that sense organ to tell the nervous system, hey, something happened. And only once that has happened does the nervous system respond. And so there is some, the more contemporary literature will refer to it being your sensory responsiveness, but registration is the process that underlies that. I'm not going to go into too much detail now because there's a separate slide for each process, but the second process then is called modulation, and I will show you in just a minute that that is the process where we filter information and decide what's important and what not. Then we have discrimination, which is our ability to ascribe meaning to and know the what, where, how of the sensory input. And then the fourth one is praxis, where everything comes together and we need to generate a response to our environment. So tonight we're going to focus on registration and modulation, and next week we are going to zoom into more detail on discrimination and praxis. So if we look at registration then, we have different thresholds for registration in our different sensory systems. So it works like a pain threshold. If you have a low threshold, you don't need a lot of information. It's very little and your system registers quickly that something has happened. If you have a high threshold, it means that you need a lot of information and your system takes quite a bit longer to respond to that input. And so depending on how high or how low your threshold in your different sensory systems are, you will respond differently to the input because the intensity with which you experience it is different. I think you will all be able to think of examples of where someone in your household has a different experience to sensory input than you. I really don't like noise. I don't like things to be on in the background when I'm trying to work. But my husband really loves having the TV on all the time. And that was something big we had to adapt to when we first married, because he likes the TV to be on and playing in the background, or there's always a radio or something going on, because his threshold for this noise input is high. Mine is really, really low. And so I get irritated and I'm forever switching it off because I can't take it anymore. So that is how our systems can differ in how responsive we are to different types of input. So our systems is a little bit like a bucket. That is my favorite analogy to use to explain this. Some of us have small buckets like me for noise. Some of us have really big buckets and can take a lot, like my husband for noise. And there's a whole continuum of everything in between. We don't only get small and big buckets, there's a whole range of sizes. And we also have a different sized bucket for each sense. And that's what makes sensory integration sometimes so complicated, because it's not just straightforward. You're sensitive, you have a big bucket, and so we know what's going on. It can be very different in different sensory systems. So in our family, for example, again, I have a really big bucket for vestibular inputs. I love going on rides at the show. Just don't make me free fall. That I don't like. But anything that spins or moves quickly, I love that. My husband can't take it at all. So while he has a high threshold and a big bucket for noise, he has a really small bucket for movement. And I'm the other way around. And so for every sensory system, we have a different sized bucket. The next thing that I want to show you about this bucket is that we also have something that controls what we allow into this bucket. What are we going to put in and what are we going to keep out of this bucket? And the process that helps us with that is called sensory modulation. Sensory modulation acts like a filter. It decides what information is important and that goes through into the bucket, and what is not important and that stays out of the bucket. Now this process happens in the middle of our brain, right there in the middle. If we look at the brain like in the half, that filter bit sits there in the middle of the brain as the sensory information comes into the brain. The best example I can give you of this is that while I'm speaking to you, until I say it, you are completely probably unaware of the pressure of the seat under your bum. You might be unaware of any noises in your environment until I now alert you to listen to what other noises there are in the environment, because hopefully the filter is telling you that listening to what is coming from your computer screen or your phone is now important, and it's filtering out the other information that's in the environment, whether it's your kids maybe having a fight or the dog barking next door. The filter is trying to ignore that and to let in the information that you are trying to focus on. The other very good example of how our brain acts as a filter is how quickly our sense of smell adapts to an environmental input. So if you walk into a place, when you walk in there, you immediately smell something. Like when you're in a perfume store, you might smell those smells very strongly. And after a while, you're not aware of that anymore. And that is that filtering process where the brain decides, okay, this is not important. I don't need to keep telling you that you are smelling perfume now. So that really helps us to adapt to the environment and focus on what is important and what is not. So that further complicates the matter, because some of us have good filters despite having a very small bucket, and some of us have really bad filters despite having quite a big bucket. And so trying to figure out how all of this fits together is all part of the process of coming to know how your nervous system works and how you can best process the information in your environment, and then actually most importantly adapt your environment to best suit and fit with your own sensory profile, if that is possible, because we can't always change things in the environment, but for those things that we can. So this slide really is, I'm just writing out in sentences basically what I've just explained, and that is that every person's brain processes sensory information differently depending on the size of the bucket and the effectiveness of the filter. So when our buckets are small, the brain registers information quickly. When they are big, it takes time and more input to register, and the filter helps the brain to decide what to let in and what information to ignore. So both buckets and filters operate on a continuum. It's not just high or low, and each person has a range of bucket sizes in the different sensory systems that may differ from person to person and from system to system. So our reaction to incoming information also differs. So how we respond to information based on the size of our bucket and the size of our filter can be typical. It can be like most people would expect us to respond, or we could be overreactive, or we could be underreactive to that sensory input. And sometimes it's good to know what best describes you, because it helps us understand ourselves so much better. It helps us understand ourselves as parents, as co-workers, in many of our roles, how if we have good insight into our own sensory profiles, we really understand our responses to situations better as well. So some children then, if we take it back to our kids, are slow to warm up and take longer to register sensory information, and so we call them underreactive. They may typically be your couch potato, that you kind of feel like you have to light a little fireworks under them to get them moving. They might be very slow to get started in the morning. They may be daydreamy in class. It really takes a lot before they engage and before they play. And remember, I am now describing the extreme. There are lots of different presentations in between. Some kids cannot get enough sensory input. They seek sensory input. They are the usually on-the-go ones that just simply can't get enough. They will try to get as much input as they possibly can. And whenever I look at this picture of this little guy heading down the hill, my stomach sits in my throat to think what's going to happen, and then part of me thinks, wow, that looks nice, I wish I could do that. And so some kids just seek out sensory input. And when we talk about how different conditions overlap, this is also kids that often look like an ADHD kid, and there's also a lot of overlap. between that, which I will refer to in a later slide. But typically they are kids that need a lot of sensory input and they seek it out. On the previous slide, your more under-responsive profile actually also need more sensory input, but they don't go and look for it. These little ones look for it. They want it and they need it and they make sure that they get it. And then some kids are over-responsive. They have small buckets, usually not very good filters to decide what's going on and how to respond to that. And so this is the typical pictures and stories that we see and hear of over-responsive kids. So this picture of William and Kate's wedding was one that immediately stuck in my mind, because this little girl here in the red circle, she was just one that my heart went out, and I thought all of this noise, all of the people cheering, all of this hype, and she's just like, this is too much. I don't like it. The expression says it all. So that was priceless. And then some other responses that like shouting and saying, I cannot do this, withdrawing, going away from the action, trying to get away from too much input, or just being completely overwhelmed by it. And so these over-responsive children are very susceptible to having the fight, flight, or fright type of response to sensory input. So in fight mode, you will see behaviors like being aggressive and responding aggressively, being resistant, being agitated when people come too close. They might have difficulty bonding and difficulty with social interactions because they have this fight type of response to sensory overload. Then you get your flight response, where they will withdraw. There will be avoidance behavior. They might react by moving away from the group whenever things become overwhelming. They might also be the class clown who tries to shift the attention away from what they're busy with that is overwhelming them, just so that they can get out of the situation. Or that child that frequently needs to go to the bathroom, that's always restless, that always wants to go and drink water, trying to escape the situation. And then we get the fright response, which is your child that will typically be very shy, reluctant to communicate, struggle with focusing, saying I can't, whiny, clingy, tearful, and just scared. Life is a scary place. And so over-responsiveness can have many faces. I think that's the take-home message from this slide, that sensory over-responsiveness doesn't always look like fighting. It doesn't always look like flight. It doesn't always look like fright, but it has a connection to our autonomic nervous system. That is the part of our nervous system that controls this fight, flight and fright response. And sensory over-responsive children usually have an exaggerated fight, flight, and fright response in the brain. So one more story about buckets. I'm watching my time because I know I still have a lot to say and time is running out very fast. So all of our buckets have a level at which, as long as the bucket is filled to that level, we are happy and we are okay. When our buckets are too empty or too full, that is when the wheels come off. So I usually tell parents, you know, the bucket is too full when it starts overflowing here in the form of tears. And when the bucket is too empty, we often get that seeking type of behavior. Now, we all have different profiles that fluctuate throughout the day. If you can kind of maintain your buckets in that green zone, like the blue line on the screen at the moment, you are generally okay. If you often under-respond, if your bucket is often too empty, you might get that under-responsive kind of picture that we had earlier. If you often go into over-arousal, you might get that over-responsive picture that we had with the fight-flight type of response. And then we also get those that really fluctuate between over and under responsivity. And somehow that's usually the kids that end up with me in the practice, because they are really, really hard to figure out, really, really hard to know what should we do? What is the best approach? Is he under aroused? Is he over aroused? How do we change that? And so These are all of the different profiles, and these things all affect our ability to be focused and to pay attention. Because if our bucket is not in the green zone, if we are over aroused or under aroused, we cannot pay sufficient attention to our environment that is in front of us at the moment, because we are having to battle with how full our buckets are. And so this slide I'm just very briefly going to refer to in terms of that sensory input influences our arousal, our level of awakeness, and our ability to pay attention. And if we cannot stay within that green zone, we often see that they really struggle with maintaining focus in tasks like homework and school. So just one brief mention then of sensory integration and other conditions, because I'm sure as I was talking, many of you might have wondered, but isn't that ADHD? Isn't that an anxiety disorder? Isn't that something else? And what do we know about sensory integration and different conditions? So I've mentioned ADHD, I've mentioned anxiety, and then autism spectrum disorders is also something that we very, very often see the sensory integration difficulties. In fact, it is part of the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. So this orange bubble in the middle of your screen, then the SMD stands for sensory modulation disorder, and that's what we've been talking about tonight. Problems with that filter and with the bucket size, and being able to regulate and modulate how full our buckets are throughout the day. And we have very good evidence from research, and I don't have time to show you the research. I can just tell you that there is an overlap, a big overlap, in fact, between difficulties with sensory modulation and different other conditions. The slide is purposefully made in this way to show that with anxiety, for example, we see a very big overlap. There's a very high correlation between anxiety and sensory over-responsivity. With ADHD, the overlap is slightly smaller. There is an overlap, and there are children that have both. There are children that have only sensory modulation problems, and then there are children that have only ADHD. So that overlap is slightly smaller, and I probably could have made the autism overlap a bit bigger than I made it on the screen, but then you couldn't see the words, but there's also a big overlap. And so when we see sensory integration problems, we obviously also think about other conditions that are related to these difficulties, and we know that there are overlaps and that these things influence one another. And so that should be part of the holistic view with which we approach this. But there's also a big proportion of children that only have sensory modulation problems and no other conditions in addition to that. So that's also important to know that it can exist on its own, despite that in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic gold standard, there isn't a sensory integration diagnosis on its own, but we know from clinical practice, and there's lots of research to support, that children can have sensory modulation disorders or other sensory integration problems on their own as well. Okay, so what can I do to help? And somehow I always leave too little time to get to the what can I do to help one. So when you have a child that struggles with sensory integration, whether they are over-responsive, sensory seeking, whatever the case is, this is my mantra, the 3 R's. Recognize, respect, and respond. Recognize that sometimes, very often, behavior is not being naughty. Behavior might be related to how overwhelmed a sensory or a nervous system is at that point in time. Respect refers to respecting your child's sensory profile and needs, respecting the fact that these sensory needs are real and that they need to be accommodated within the environment, and then respond accordingly. Respond from that position of recognition and respect to what you're seeing in front of you. Now the next question becomes, but how do I respond? What can I do? What is practical things that I can implement to help my child? So I tried to divide it into your under and over responsive groups. So your child that is the under responsive or slow to warm up, and your sensory seeking child, both of them are dependent on sensory input to keep them focused and alert. We need to try and keep their buckets full enough. Their buckets are often too empty. So we have to allow them to take in higher amounts of sensory nourishment. It really is like food for the nervous system, and help them fill their buckets. Push and pull type of activities work really well. Carrying heavy objects around, any movement, play up. That's why Otis always loves saying just play outside, because it has so many opportunities for movement, being on a trampoline, on a jungle gym. In a school setting, this might be the child that you need to send to go and deliver the message to the teacher next door, to get them moving and get their nervous systems nourished, so that they can then focus again for the next bit of class time that they need to attend to. And then breaking their work into smaller chunks to allow them to take sensory breaks is a strategy that sometimes helps with homework, so that they can get input, come back, do a little bit, get input, come back, do a little bit, because having to sit still literally deprives their sensory systems of the nourishment it needs if it goes on for too long. Then for our same group of children, our slow to warm up or sensory seeking children, what are the warning signs? How do I know that here's a bit more going on and things that need further investigation? It's not just a normal variation of sensory processing. If we see absence episodes, so that daydreamy child that seems to be missing information in class, if there really is absence episodes with limited memory of what happened in that period, we need to investigate further, because that could indicate things like absence seizures. We need to look out for fatigue and investigate that further, because if that sort of daydreaminess is because they are tired or because they are feeling really like physiologically fatigued, we need to investigate that further for things like iron deficiencies and many other things that could impact on that. And then if they miss important environmental cues that have an impact on their safety or on their learning, that's also a sign that we need to investigate further and get professional help. If a child is so absorbed in their own world that they will walk right across the street without looking whether a car is coming, age appropriately obviously now, then those are things we need to tend to further. And then in terms of our sensory seeking children, being unable to know when they've had enough, potential to harm self or others, so if their seeking behaviors are really excessive or inappropriate, and when it becomes disruptive within the environment despite reasonable accommodations. And I always put that sentence in there, because there always is space for reasonable accommodations for children that really need this. But even despite reasonable accommodations, some children might still be disruptive in their environment and will need support to deal with that a little bit better. For our over-responsive children, we want to try and identify our child's sensory needs. What do they prefer and what do they really dislike? We can use calming sensations to help them cope better when they become overwhelmed. So deep touch pressure in whatever way you give it, whether it's with a hug, whether it is with a weighted toy, a heavy toy or a heavy blanket. You get all nice fancy things like stretch blankets for the bed at night that stretch over the mattress. Lots of different ways that we can give deep pressure, but generally speaking, deep pressure is a calming sensation. Slow rhythmical movements are calming. We know that from how babies love being rocked. And then weight-bearing positions like crawling or walking like a wheelbarrow and bearing weight on more than just our feet tends to be calming as well. We want to avoid fleeting hands and light touch, tickling, rubbing them over their hair. Those are things that can tend to overstimulate an over-responsive child, and less is better. So when we look at the spaces in which these children live, learn and play, we want to look at how can we reduce sensory overload in the environment? How can we use natural light as opposed to artificial light? How big are the groups we're expecting them to function in? So at this point, I'm quickly going to just share, I'm watching the time, that my own daughter at dinner tonight, she's in grade 1, told me that she and her friend decided they don't want lockdown to be over ever again, because in this lockdown time, they are not allowed to touch each other on the playground, and there are boys that always chase them and that catch them, and they just find this whole lockdown thing awesome because now nobody can chase them and catch them. And I just told her, my child, there's so many other kids that feel just like you, because our sensory over-responsive children are having a ball of a time at school at the moment, because nobody can come into their space. Nobody are allowed to touch their things and do things to them that they don't want to be done to. The groups are smaller because everybody has to socially distance. And so for many kids, I know it's not all of them, but for many sensory over-responsive kids, school is the best it's ever been. And then we also need to look at with whom they are in the group, because putting a very strong sensory seeking child in the same group as an over-responsive child is a recipe for a mess. So that's one tip I can give teachers maybe, or any persons working with groups of children, that if you can group, try not to put the extremes in the same group, the extreme profiles in the same group, because that might just lead to some natural clashes. And then it's important to respect their personal space, allow them for time out and to escape, and don't cram their programs too full. It's illness of our time that programs are full. Like another advantage of our current situation is that very few extramurals can continue. And so while as professionals, we are really concerned about the effect of deprivation from those types of activities. At the same time, we are also seeing some of the benefits of kids not having overloaded activity programs and being able to cope better with their environments. So when does it become like warning signs for over-responsive children? When they withdraw and become unresponsive and really go into shutdown, when there's potential harm to themselves or others, when they become so overwhelmed that they really go into a tantrum and are unable to protect themselves or potentially harm others, when we see signs of anxiety and depression, when we see extreme avoidance behavior, and when we see psychosomatic symptoms. That's the word we use for when our bodies are telling us what's going on in our minds. So your tummy aches, your headaches, your things that lead to avoidance of certain situations. Those are the warning signs that we want to go and investigate a little bit further. So this is the core of what I had planned to talk about tonight. There are a few frequently asked questions that I might leave if they don't come up in the question section for our next session together. But then I'm going to invite questions, Karen. I know you are going to rejoin to just pose some of the questions, and then we can address those.
Okay, thank you, Elize. And wow. I must tell you, this is what's so wonderful about you, is that you really explain it in such a manner that anyone can understand it. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Colin.
Okay, so Elize, I've got one that a mom I just want to quickly, she asked in Afrikaans, so I just want to quickly translate it. She says, how do you explain to a 4-year-old that likes touch, that other children of the same age don't like being touched? How would you handle that?
Yeah, well, that's a really nice, tricky example of when we have probably a sensory seeker that really likes touching others, and then the friends at school don't. And that is something that I really like using stories for that age group. So we call it a social story, but where we can make up our own story about how people experience what that child is doing with them, and giving them a little bit of an insight through a very non-blaming type of situation, not telling you're wrong, you shouldn't, but just making a story of it, and say, telling a story of the friends that's playing at school, and this one, when this friend runs past, he really gets a big fight. And then the other friend, when that one brushes past and touches them or gives them a hug, he feels you're squeezing too tight. And so you can make up a little story about how others perceive that in different ways, and how for the one doing it, it actually is really nice. But what else can I do to get that kind of input? So we always, if we want to discourage one behavior, we need to also replace it with something else. And so we could try and offer him alternatives depending on what's available in his environment, whether he can touch a soft toy, whether you can hug the teacher, whatever the appropriate alternatives would be in the environment, you could work that into a story as well. So that's one example. I mean, there's different ways, but that's one way in which one could try to explain to that age group.
Great, thank you so much. We've got another one here. And Mom, Anamine says, my kiddos 8 and 5 seem to have characteristics of both under and over. My son has been diagnosed with Asperger's and my daughter seems to be the complete opposite. Don't I know that? Is this normal?
Indeed. Now, normal is also a relative term, but very much. So a lot of kids, and it often happens when the buckets are different sizes in different sensory systems. So if we dig a little deeper, we might find that they are very over responsive, let's say, to light touch. They might be really finicky about labels in clothes and about type of fabric they wear or whatever. And they might be really seeking for vestibular movement and proprioceptive type of activities. So that's a profile that we see quite often, is that kind of contradicting in the one set of systems and then seeking in the other ones. And so, yes, it's normal in the sense that actually, for most of us, we have different buckets for different sensory systems. And so we display characteristics of both groups. And children then, and I don't know why, but we tend to marry the opposite profile and we tend to have kids with the opposite profile. So I guess it's about becoming, an integrated whole within the family dynamic, but it definitely keeps life interesting.
For sure. That's why we need to attend things like this so that we as parents, can get all the knowledge and know what to do and what not to do.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Dorothy is asking, how do you integrate sensory input in a daily schedule? Can it be according to a schedule or must it be according to what the child needs?
Yes. So I think there's more than one answer to that question. So the ideal is to be able to give it to the child when they need it. But then you need to know when they're going to need it, because sometimes they, by the time you realize that is what they need, it's kind of a bit too late. So I think it's a little bit of a balance. When we know the child well, we can look at kind of acting proactively. So if we're talking about, let's say, a sensory seeking child, for example, that, really struggles to sit still with homework time, don't go and sit with him straight after school if he hasn't had time to move yet. Give him time to move. So work that is kind of a fixed schedule. When you get home, you get time to move, and then we come and sit for a while, and then you can move again. But then the other part of the answer is that when we see that our children have sensory needs and we can respond to those needs in that moment, that is the ideal, because that helps them to regulate how full their buckets are, and then ultimately to function better.
And I think the thing is, if I look back at my son, and I shared a little bit on my live, how Henry, when after a day of work, he would come home and he would be he was so, at that stage when I didn't have the knowledge, naughty, didn't want to do homework. I wanted to get going so that we can finish it, but I didn't know this. And then you handle the situation totally wrong. And after I gained the knowledge, I knew with him, for instance, when I got home, he had to unwind, and for him, it was in front of the television. Yeah. And then if I gave him that time, he was just calm and relaxed, and we had no issues. And again, that's why I'm saying it's so important for parents to have this, be a proactive parent. Get all the information that you can, because that just helps you to handle situations at home much, much better. Okay.
Absolutely. And it literally gives you different glasses. It gives you different spectacles with which to look at your child and with which to interpret the behavior that you're seeing. And that helps us to know what we can do.
Yeah. And there's no wrong or right. You need to try all the different things, and then you'll find what works with your child.
Yeah. And if you know what to look out for.
Exactly.
Because then you know what to, once you've tried it, what has worked and what not. So absolutely.
Yes. Okay, so I've got 2 more questions, and then we're gonna leave. If there's any more questions, we'll leave it for next week, if that's okay with you, Elize.
No problem.
I've got a mom, Nelia's asking, would a child who bumps himself often or hurts himself constantly all day be considered sensory seeking?
So I am going to leave that question for next week.
For next time.
Join us next week. I'll show you. If you're not, then we'll chat over email. But so that bumping into things can be seeking if it's purposeful, but most often it's a result of that discrimination and praxis functions that we'll talk about next week. That is going haywire. So I hope Nelia can join us next week.
Nelia, next time you need to register for next week's one so that we can answer that one for you. Okay, then Krishna's asking, if a 4-year-old walks to parents' room when she wakes up every night between 12 and 3, could it be that she seeks sensory, deep touch body next to her?
Yep.
Yeah.
Daughter, 7-year-old still does that.
Me too, my Lord Lamiki.
Coffee. Yeah, it's sometimes a sensory need and sometimes it's just an emotional need, because we have emotional buckets too. And some have really big emotional buckets. And I find that my kids need more of me at night if they've had less of me during the day. So they make up for that time, even if it's during sleep. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so last one, Nelia says she's going to be on next time, so we'll answer.
Right.
Okay. Is it common or normal for a sensory-seeking child to push or cross boundaries, or is it not able to, or is not able to maintain preset or pre-established boundaries?
So my question back is just, are you referring to like discipline type boundaries or physical boundaries? But I think the answer for both would be similar. I think there's also quite a big overlap between temperament and sensory profiles. There's some interesting research on that. But for more dominating kind of personalities tend to have more sensory seeking profiles as well. And so that overlap really makes that question hard to answer, to say chicken and egg, you know, are they pushing because of personality and temperament, or are they pushing because of sensory seeking? But I can tell from what we know from research that there is quite a big overlap between that profile and that temperament, and that it would be, I would expect to see that in some kids, yes.
Okay. Well, I think that's all for now. I want to wrap up, and I want to say thank you, Elize. And I'm now an older mom. I mean, my oldest son is 20, the other one is 18, and then I've got a lot, Lamiki. But what I've learned from you, and I think you and me both, we talk a lot about these things, is we want parents to realize that being proactive is very important. And everything that you shared tonight points to me, for all the young parents out there, is that your children needs to play a lot. They need to play when they're small, in the ground. Am I right, Elize?
Absolutely, yeah. In play, they will also show you what their sensory needs are, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be challenging them. We can and should challenge our children playfully to do the things that they might not naturally, move towards. But absolutely, I mean, that is the way we encounter the world as children, is through playing. And if we're going to sit in front of the TV all the time, it's not, yes, the TV is bad too, but it's not so much the TV that is so bad, but all the opportunities that we are missing out on, that we are not getting, that nourishes that nervous system to be able to integrate our sensory information at the end.
Okay, thank you so much, Elize. I just want to end off and tell you, everyone that's on the Zoom and on Facebook, that we do have a parent and teacher support group. We call it the School Support Lounge, where we do a lot of these. If parents have any questions with regards to anything school related, if it's concentration, homework, things like that, we are there to assist you. We've got a whole board of professionals. We've got, like Elize, OTs in there, we've got speech therapists in there, we've got doctors in there. So we really try and give the research information out there to parents, so that, you know, we were talking this morning, Elize and I, that there's so many groups out there where people are giving other people advice of things that are not true, things that are not well researched, and then you give people, if you give people the wrong information, they're not going to get results, and then it's a total negative spiral down. So if you are interested in joining this group, I will put the link in there. And like I said, we've got wonderful people like Elize. We've got other speakers coming up for the rest of the year as well. And our main goal is to serve the community with information that really is true and substantial. It can be proved. Like you saw Elize with the whole time talking about it's research, because that's what you need, not just someone's opinion. And especially with sensory integration, I'm talking about my own experiences. Elize, and you need to help me here. You need to go to someone that's qualified for sensory integration.
Yes, yes, it is a postgraduate qualification, and in South Africa only occupational therapists can do that qualification. I'm quickly going to share a last screen if I can get my computer to cooperate, which it's not doing at the moment, but it has some web addresses. I'll share it next week as well. Just if my computer is not cooperating, so we'll do it.
We'll put it in the link. We can put it in the comments as well.
Yes. Just for the website of the South African Institute for Sensory Integration, and they have a catalogue of qualified therapists. So if you ever want to check, you can just check with them.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, everyone, thank you so much again for joining us. We hope we've got wonderful responses, and thank you. We're very happy that you are learning a lot, and we are looking forward to seeing you next week again. Thank you, Elize.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Okay, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.